Hi, folks. Welcome to the Financial Argument. The latest news from around the world, the disturbing numbers, and even the official institutions that spent years softening the language are now being forced to admit what is coming. In 2026, a destructive global food crisis and waves of food shortages have already begun. You do not need to be a mathematician to read these numbers, and you do not need to be a geopolitical analyst to see where these headlines are heading. These are not just signs of food inflation. They point to one of the most dramatic global food shortages humanity may ever face. As you can see from the FAO Food Price Index, the picture for 2026 is already serious. But this chart does not show the real disaster, because the prices you see at the grocery store do not rise at the grocery store. A food shortage does not suddenly appear as empty shelves in a supermarket. It rises first at the diesel pump. It rises in the fertilizer warehouse. It rises in the price of seeds, in the farmer's credit account, in irrigation costs, in insurance policies, in the tank of the truck, in port fees, in freight rates, and in the risk calculations of wholesalers. And if you are lucky, you see it last on the price tag at the shelf. I say if you are lucky, because when the shelves are empty, when disorder begins, and when you realize you made no preparations at all, it will already be too late. Once you understand this, you also understand why preparedness culture is no longer treated like something for crazy people. It has become a middle-class reflex. You understand why, in Australia, 1 out of every 6 people is now considered a prepper. And as I have been saying for years in my previous videos, you also understand why China treats food shortage as the state's #1 security issue. While individuals are becoming preppers, China itself is acting like a national prepper. While almost every country tries to show consumers that it is focused on price reductions in supermarket prices, China looks at the bigger picture and treats food security as a national security file. That difference is not a coincidence. When we turn to the United States, the picture does not become calmer, it becomes darker. Because for America, this is not just a year of higher food prices. This is a year where drought, diesel, fertilizer, wheat, insurance, credit, and weather risk are all pressing on the farmer at the same time. One of the richest agricultural systems in the world is not being hit from one direction. It is being surrounded. Reuters describes the pressure on U.S. farmers as a combination of drought and rising input costs, with plain states like Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and South Dakota under severe strain. The Reuters report from West Texas gives us the image that explains the whole crisis better than any chart. Scott Earlbeck crouched in a field of stunted wheat plants and slipped his hand into a crack in the ground wide enough to swallow it. He planted the crop last autumn, waited for rain, and the rain simply did not come. Now he is hoping the insurance adjuster declares the crop a total loss, because harvesting what remains may cost more in fuel than the crop is worth. That is not just a bad season. That is the moment when farming begins to look economically irrational. And this is exactly where the food crisis begins. Not in the supermarket, not with an empty shelf. It begins in a field where the crop is too weak to justify the cost of harvesting. It begins when a farmer looks at the price of diesel, the condition of the soil, the insurance paperwork, and the remaining crop, and starts asking whether it even makes sense to continue. When food production reaches that point, the damage has already entered the system. The consumer will only see it later. The drought numbers behind this are not ordinary. NOAA says the January to March period of 2026 was the driest first 3 months ever recorded for the contiguous United States. Rainfall was less than 70% of average, and drought expanded to nearly 60% of the country. So when we talk about America's food system, we are not talking about a few dry farms on the edge of the map. We are talking about a national-level dry signal at the very beginning of the growing season. That matters because drought does not only reduce yield, it changes the psychology of farming. It makes every decision more expensive and more dangerous. Do you spend money on fertilizer if the rain may not come? Do you spend money on fuel if the crop may not be worth harvesting? Do you plant again next season if the soil has already betrayed you once? These are not abstract questions. These are the decisions that quietly decide how much food reaches the market months later. Now look at wheat. According to USDA projections reported by the Associated Press, U.S. wheat production is expected to fall to 1.56 billion bushels, down 21% from 2025, and the smallest crop since 1972. In Kansas, one of America's most important wheat states, 58% of the crop has been rated poor or very poor. That is not a small agricultural footnote. Wheat is bread. Wheat is flour. Wheat is pasta. Wheat is animal feed. Wheat is inflation hiding inside the food chain. And Kansas is not just another wheat state. It is one of the symbolic hearts of American grain production. So when Kansas wheat is this weak, the message is not local, it is national. A bad wheat crop in a normal year would already matter. A bad wheat crop in a year of expensive diesel, expensive fertilizer, drought, shipping risk, and global food insecurity becomes something more disturbing. It becomes a warning that the foundation is cracking while the roof is still pretending to stand. The fertilizer problem makes the situation even uglier because fertilizer damage is delayed. If farmers cannot afford full fertilizer application today, the harvest does not scream immediately. The field may still look alive, the season may still move forward, but months later the missing nutrients return as lower yields, weaker crops, reduced production potential, and higher prices. Farm Policy News, summarizing the Farm Bureau survey, reported that 70% of U.S. farmers said they could not afford all the fertilizer they needed for the 2026 planting season. The same report warned that reduced fertilizer use or acreage changes increase the risk of lower yields and reduced production potential. This is why fertilizer is more dangerous than it looks. The public does not see a fertilizer shortage on the shelf. They see it later as expensive bread, expensive meat, expensive dairy, and expensive processed food. Fertilizer is one of those hidden pillars of modern abundance. When that pillar weakens, the collapse does not need to be immediate to be real. Diesel is the other hidden pillar. Modern food does not move by itself. Tractors, combines, irrigation pumps, refrigerated trucks, port operations, long-haul transport, all of it burns through energy. In California, AAA data shows diesel averaging around $7.40 per gallon, with several regions even higher. That number is not just painful for drivers, it is a warning for the food chain, because every gallon burned between the field and the shelf becomes part of the final price. California makes that warning especially serious. It is not just an expensive state with high fuel prices. California is one of the most important food-producing regions in America. The state's own agricultural statistics describe it as the top agricultural state and say it accounts for nearly 2/3 of U.S. vegetable production. So when California is hit by diesel costs, water pressure, labor costs, regulation, drought, and transport costs at the same time, the impact does not stay in California. It moves into the produce aisle. It moves into fruit, vegetables, nuts, and fresh food. And this is where the situation starts to look less like bad luck and more like a pattern. The most fragile points are not being hit one by one with years of breathing room in between. They are being hit together. Wheat is weak, diesel is expensive, fertilizer is strained, drought is spreading, California is under pressure. Farmers are talking about insurance instead of harvest. This is not the language of a healthy food system. Above all of this comes the El Niño risk. According to NOAA's Climate Prediction Center, El Niño is likely to emerge soon, with an 82% chance in May to July 2026, and a 96% chance of continuing through the Northern Hemisphere winter of 2026 to 27. In other words, this is not a remote possibility buried in a model. The official forecast is already pointing to a major climate pattern arriving and staying through the period that matters for weather, crops, water, and food prices. But the most disturbing question is not only whether El Niño arrives, it is how strong it becomes. Paul Roundy, a professor of atmospheric science at the University at Albany, told BBC Science Focus that there is roughly a 50% chance this event becomes the strongest El Niño in the historical record. A few weeks earlier, he had put that chance at around 20%. That kind of shift should not be treated like background noise. When a specialist moves from 1 in 5 to almost a coin toss in a matter of weeks, something in the system is changing fast. People magazine's coverage also points to the same concern. Subsurface Pacific temperatures are significantly above average. Conditions may support El Niño development by June, and current signals are being compared with 1997, one of the strongest El Niño events of the modern record. The article also notes that the 1997 to 98 event was linked to trillions of dollars in global income losses over the following years. So this is not just a weather story. It is an economic story, an agricultural story, and for weak countries, a food security story. This is the sentence we should not soften. History has seen El Niño before, but history has not seen this exact setup. A possible record-strength El Niño is not arriving into a calm, cheap, stable, well-supplied world. It is arriving into a world already strained by diesel prices, fertilizer stress, weak wheat production, drought, war risk, shipping uncertainty, and countries quietly thinking about food security like national defense. That combination is what makes 2026 feel so different. El Niño does not need to destroy every crop in every country to matter. It only needs to disturb rainfall in the wrong regions at the wrong time. It only needs to add drought here, flood there, heat somewhere else, and uncertainty everywhere. A global food crisis is not created by one single disaster. It is created when enough stress points begin to connect. That is the American warning sign. The United States is not just having a difficult farming year. It is showing what happens when a modern agricultural machine is hit by climate stress, input inflation, energy dependence, crop weakness, and financial pressure at the same time. If this is happening inside one of the richest agricultural systems on Earth, the darker question is obvious. What happens to countries that import their food, borrow in dollars, and have no margin for error? The American farmer is standing at the front edge of this crisis. He sees the cracks in the soil before the consumer sees the empty space on the shelf. He sees the fuel bill before the family sees the higher price of bread. He sees the fertilizer invoice before the public hears the word shortage. By the time the crisis reaches the grocery store, it will not be the beginning. It will be the delayed public face of a failure that started months earlier in the field. No country is immune anymore. That is the part people still do not want to understand. A global food crisis does not mean every country collapses in the same way, at the same time. It means the same pressure begins to appear everywhere, in different forms. Higher grocery bills in one country, fertilizer panic in another, emergency food relief in another, wheat losses somewhere else, and governments suddenly talking about food security as if they have just discovered the word. Canada is one of the clearest examples. This is not a poor country. This is not a country people usually associate with hunger headlines. Yet Canada's Food Price Report 2026 forecasts food prices rising by 4 to 6%, with a family of 4 potentially spending almost 1,000 Canadian dollars more on food in a single year. Canadian government notes also point to a darker background. Roughly 1/4 of people in the provinces experienced food insecurity in 2023, with the rate even higher among children. That is what food stress looks like in a wealthy country. It does not always begin with famine. It begins with families quietly losing the ability to absorb another grocery bill. In the United Kingdom, the crisis has already been eating into households for years. According to the House of Commons Library, UK food prices rose by 38.6% between November 2020 and November 2025. That is not a temporary shock anymore. That is a permanent wound in the cost of living. And even after years of pressure, the Food Foundation's April 2026 tracker shows food inflation rising again. So when British families hear officials talk about stabilization, many of them are looking at prices that never really came back down. The crisis did not disappear. It became normal, and that may be the most dangerous part.
Europe shows us where the food crisis becomes policy. The European Union is not suspending fertilizer duties because everything is fine. It is doing it because fertilizer has become a strategic vulnerability. Reuters reported that the EU moved to suspend customs duties on key nitrogen-based fertilizers after the Hormuz disruption pushed global fertilizer markets into stress. Another Reuters report said nitrogen fertilizer prices in the EU had risen to around 58% above 2024 averages. That is not just a farmer's problem. Fertilizer is future food. When Europe starts changing trade rules to protect fertilizer access, it means the pressure has already reached the level of government emergency management.
Australia may be the most symbolic case because there the crisis appears on both sides, production and psychology. Reuters reports that Australian farmers, hit by Iran war-related fuel and fertilizer costs and worsening dry weather, are planting significantly less wheat, with harvest losses projected between 16 and 41%. Some farmers are cutting fertilizer use and shifting crops just to survive the season. At the same time, Australian media reports that 1 in 6 Australians have already made changes to their homes to prepare for global instability, while SBS notes that prepper used to be a dirty word but is now being treated by ordinary people as something sensible. That is the shift. When a major food exporting country faces wheat pressure, and its middle class starts treating self-sufficiency as normal, the message is not local, it is global. This is where the crisis becomes global. Not because every country has the same problem, but because every country is revealing a different crack in the same system. Canada shows affordability stress. Britain shows long-term food inflation becoming embedded. Europe shows fertilizer turning into a strategic emergency. Australia shows climate, input costs, wheat production, and prepper psychology converging. Different countries, different symptoms, but the same disease underneath. And that disease is simple. The world built a food system that depends on cheap energy, available fertilizer, stable weather, open trade routes, affordable credit, and political calm. In 2026, almost none of those assumptions look safe anymore. What I have shown you today is only one window into the historic disruption that is now approaching, the window of the global food crisis. But this is not happening in isolation. Alongside the coming food shortages, the monetary system itself is also changing. The world is moving towards some form of global currency reset, and in the next videos, we will talk about what that really means. Everything is stacking on top of everything else. Food, energy, debt, war, currencies, and trust in the system itself. Please understand how serious this is, and make sure you and your family are prepared. God bless y'all.